Okay. We're going to sing a medley this evening, so if you would join us, we're going to several songs. My Jesus, I love thee. Take my life at Calvary, and I am thine, O Lord. Would you stand and sing as we begin our worship? Join us now as we welcome each other in our fellowship time.
As you folks are making your way back to your seats this evening, you can turn to Genesis chapter 11. See, you just thought we were done with the book of Genesis. We're back there already. But we're going to be in verses really 29 and 30 tonight to help get us started. But as we get started this evening, we want to take any prayer concerns that you might have. And so we'll take those and start a new list for this coming Sunday. really, after doing our introduction last week and looking at some of the sobering statistics about women in the Bible, we are starting with our first extraordinary woman, and we're going to be looking at the biography or the life of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And, as we look at each of the ladies that we will be studying in this particular study, we're going to look at their biography, we're going to look at their life and their death and lessons that we learned from them. And so we're going to start off with Sarah's biography, and you'll see it on the screen tonight. The first thing that we see is her name, which is obviously goes from Sarai to Sarah after God changes her name. Sarah means princess, and so that's kind of fitting for, if you think about the way Abraham is regarded, not only in the Jewish faith, but in the days that he lived, he was seen almost as a king of a sort. And so for his wife to have a name that literally means princess, that is pretty telling. We know that she was born sometime in the 2100s BC. We don't know exactly when. There's conflicting ideas between different scholars as to the year of her birth. But we know it was in the 2100s. And we know that her birthplace, based on what we read in the book of Genesis, is that she is born in Ur of Chaldea. Now, Chaldea is, the Chaldeans are another name for the Babylonians. And so we know that Ur was in what was considered part of the Babylonian kingdom, because it was only about 140 miles southeast of Babylon, the city. And so she was born in the midst of the Babylonian culture. We know that she died, as we'll see in a little bit, 127 years later, sometime in the 2000s BC, depending on when her birth was. We see that in the scriptures that her death occurred in what we come to know in the biblical text as the city of Hebron, a place that David goes to, a place that Absalom goes to, and there's other figures such as Caleb. He takes Hebron as part of his inheritance for spying out the land for 40 years and giving a good report. But Hebron was called Kiriath Arba in those days, and it's in southern Canaan or in southern Israel. And so we know that that's where she eventually dies at. As for a profession, she was basically a wife and a mother and a homemaker, as best we would describe it today. And those three jobs in and of itself are more than enough for her to have done. But we know that the first mention of Sarai or Sarah is in Genesis chapter 11, and it's in verse 29. So we're going to look at that for just a moment because of what it tells us. And then we're going to look at her life and death. So look in Genesis chapter 11, beginning with verse 29. It says, Abram, or we know him as Abraham, but Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no children. And so right there we get a glimpse into the fact that Abraham is married to this lady Sarah, and the key thing that they focus on, because of what happens later in Sarah and Abraham's life, they point out from the get-go, your first introduction to her is she's Abraham's wife and she can't have kids, that she's barren, that there's something going on there. But we're going to look on at verses 31 through, we'll go 31 and 32. Just look at it as well. It says, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. And so when we see this, we see that they are living in this city where Abraham and Sarah and all of Abraham's brothers and sisters have been born. And then their dad picks up and moves quite a long distance from where they lived to this other city. And so we're going to look at what we find in the pages of Scripture about Sarah's life, and we're going to sort of get a glimpse of what her life entailed, and then we'll look at a lesson that we can learn from her life. But, the thing about Sarah's life is we don't really know a lot about the first half of her life. And she lived to be 127 years old. And so we don't know very much about her. We do know that she is 10 years younger than Abraham. We see that in the biblical text in numerous places, pointing out that she is 10 years younger than him. Not only that, we know that she was born in Ur of Chaldea, where Abraham was born. And the reason we know that is because she and Abraham shared a father but had different mothers. And so we know that they were basically half brother and half sister. And we also know, as we looked at just a moment ago, that in Genesis 11:30 it tells us that Sarah was unable to have children. And so in verse 31, we read about how Abraham and Sarah's father, Terah, took them and Lot and moved 575 miles northwest of Haran, or from Ur to a place called Haran. And it's it's in southern Turkey, just above the border between Turkey and Syria. Do we have a map, or is there another? Yeah, okay. When Sarah was 65 and Abraham would have been 75, Abraham was told by God, this is when God calls him to leave the place he was living and go to a place that God would show him when he arrived there. Basically saying, I'm going to show you where you need to go. And you see this here, that he headed towards the land of Canaan. And so they originally were living in Ur, and then they moved up here to Haran, which was, again, almost 600 miles away. And then God tells Abraham, says, look, I'm going to take you to a place, and I'll tell you when you get there. Don't you love those kind of directions? Especially from the Lord. He's like, I'll tell you when you get there. And Abraham's like, okay, so we're going to go. And so, as we'll see in a little bit, they go from Haran, and they actually settle down in this area and down into the Negev, about where the sea is in Canaan, because that is, when you hear them talk about the Negev, that's the southern portion, like a very desolate desert-type area in southern Israel that was not very easy to inhabit, but that's where they ended up at. And so when God called Abraham and Sarah to leave Haran, one promise that God gave them then was that this couple who is 75 and 65, the promise was that God would make Abraham into a great nation. Well, for you to be the father of a great nation, that means that you're eventually going to have what? You're going to have children. And here they are at 65 and 75 and had not had children at all at that point. And so this had to be, very encouraging to Sarah, who has struggled with infertility for all of her life and not been able to have kids. And for God to say, I'm going to make Abraham the father of a great nation, they naturally assumed that Sarah would be the one to provide the heir for that nation. And so it would be 25 years. Now think about that. It would be another 25 years, because we know that Abraham is 75 here. He doesn't have Isaac until he's 100. So it's another 25 years until God fulfills this promise. How many of us wouldn't try, like Sarah did, to try and circumvent God's plans, waiting 25 years for God to fulfill a promise? I mean, it's crazy to think about it, but that's how long they had to wait. Now, after they arrived in Canaan, what we find is that they were more specifically in the Negev, as we read in the scriptures in Genesis 12. A famine forced Abraham and Sarah to leave where they were at and go to Egypt just so they could survive. Much like what we see with his grandson Jacob. Not long after that, Jacob's family goes to Egypt to survive a famine. And so while they were in Egypt, as we know from the story, Abraham is worried that because Sarah is such an attractive woman that people would maybe kill him and take her if they knew they were married. So instead, Abraham tells a half-truth and says, well, she's my sister, to protect himself. Sort of goes back to that story. Somebody was joking about a story that I had shared one time about my grandmother, and from the pulpit, I told how my grandmother had stopped to visit a friend who was the secretary at Sawmills Elementary, and she was talking to her and told Clella May, who was one of her cousins, was talking with her and asked her if she liked chicken salad. And she said, oh, I love chicken salad. And my grandmother told Clella May, said, well, I've got you a sandwich. Gave her a sandwich for lunch and went on about her business. Well, a couple of weeks later, she saw Clella May at church or somewhere and asked Clella May how she liked that rabbit salad sandwich that she gave her. And she said, I don't eat rabbit. I don't like rabbit. I didn't eat you gave me a chicken salad sandwich. And my grandmother said, no. She said, I asked you if you like chicken salad, and you said yes. And then I told you I have a sandwich for you. I said, I never told you that it had chicken salad in it. And that's sort of that, well, it's true, but it's not true, and it's sort of this half-truth. Well, that's what Abraham and Sarah are doing, and my grandmother did that on more than one occasion. She would not tell you the truth when it came to what was in the pot sometimes. So if I look at a pot and I'm a little, leery, understand my grandmother scarred me. But nevertheless, that's what Abraham and Sarah did. And they didn't do it just in this one instance. We'll see later that they did it another time. But they come in and they tell the truth. They are half-brother and half-sister. But they're not telling the whole truth, saying that they are married. And so what we see is that Sarah is taken into Pharaoh's home. And Pharaoh sees his whole home, all that are in his household, struck with this serious illness because Sarah was in the house. And it was obviously divine providence in the way that God was seeking to protect Sarah and to protect this future generation that would come, this great nation that would come from them. And so she's taken into the home of Pharaoh. But once Pharaoh finds out the situation with Sarah, she's sort of let go from Pharaoh's home, and Pharaoh even instructs his people not to harm Abraham. And so you see that they had finally settled down here in the Negev. They end up going to Egypt during this time of famine, and they end up, after the famine is over, moving back to that general vicinity up there just north of the Negev. We're not really sure where it was at, other than one time we know where it's mentioned that he lived. But think about this. After they leave Haran and go to Canaan, they are there for 10 years after they've left Haran and come to the Negev and Egypt and back again. And Sarah starts to believe that she's not going to have children. She's not going to be able to provide this heir for Abraham. And so she comes up with a plan on how to, as I said earlier, circumvent God's plan and his timing. And so her plan was for Abraham to have a child through her slave, her maidservant, whatever you want to call her, Hagar. And so the interesting thing that I found out this week as I was preparing for this in one of the books I was reading said that according to the laws of that day, a child born to Abraham and Hagar would be considered the child of Abraham and Sarah, as well as considered their heir. Because I guess, I've never had an explanation of why, but I'm guessing because Sarah owned her as a slave, then any child she had would be seen as her heir. And so that was why Sarah attempted to provide an heir for Abraham in that way. Now, when Hagar becomes pregnant, she started treating Sarah very badly, very poorly. And Sarah returns in like fashion and starts mistreating her to the point that she runs away, but only to return at the encouragement or the prompting of the angel of the Lord. And so Hagar comes back. She eventually has a son, and he's named Ishmael. Now, this was about 10 years after they left Haran. about another 15 years. There's a gap in the timeline. We're not told a whole lot of what goes on until about 15 more years. This is 25 years after they've left Haran and after God has promised this situation. What we see is that Sarah is about 90. She's probably 89, almost 90. And it's just before Isaac is born. And we see the same scenario played out with Abimelech, the king of Gerar, in Genesis chapter 20, just like we see played out in Egypt and in with Pharaoh earlier. Now, Abimelech is a title for the king of Gerar. So you read, something that I noticed before in my Bible reading was that Abraham has this encounter with Abimelech, and he basically says, hey, we're brother and sister, don't kill me type thing. And you read a little bit later, and Isaac and Rebekah are doing the same thing, but the king sees them embracing in the garden, and then he's like, hey, what are you doing? This is your sister, and you told me, and he finds out it's the wife. Well, if you read both of those accounts in Genesis, both of them refer to the king as Abimelech. It does not mean that it was the same man. It's the title of the king of a dynasty in Gerar. And this area, this region, as we'll see in just a moment, you see right there where it's at. That region right in there, that is Philistine land. And so these people would have been the ancestors of the Philistines that the Israelites would deal with for years going forward. And so this was basically an early Philistine king that Abraham is making these treaties with and working with in a lot of different ways. But Abraham and Sarah use that same story with similar results, that they're eventually sort of kicked out and told, this isn't a good idea for y'all to be here because you're lying to us. And so when the truth is found out, Sarah is returned to Abraham, but there is a fear of God placed in the king and in Pharaoh both, not to harm Abraham because of what's happened with Sarah. But interestingly, around this same time, what we read about in the scriptures is that Sarah, who laughed at God for saying that she would become pregnant when he comes and talks to Abraham about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, what we find is that a year later, she was pregnant and gave birth to a son, the son of promise, that the line that the Messiah would eventually come from, and we know his name to be Isaac. And a few years later, when we read in the scriptures, they generally weaned their children somewhere around 3 to 5 years old. So it's hard telling how old Abraham and Sarah were when this particular story goes about. But we find that Ishmael and Hagar and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac are all attending this big celebratory feast because Abraham and Sarah are like, yay, he's weaned, we're going to have a festival. And so they have this huge feast, and at this feast, Ishmael, who is 15 years older, so you got to imagine he's somewhere around 18 to 20 years old maybe, is mocking Isaac. Again, we don't know how old Isaac was at the time, but he's mocking Isaac, and what we see is that Sarah is enraged about it. I mean, that's the only way I know to put it. And she demands that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away because she doesn't want him to be a co-heir with Isaac or anything like that. And so we see that Abraham agrees and sends them away. But sometime later, we're not told exactly when this happens, Sarah is noticeably absent from the story where Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac. She's never mentioned in the story. And the very next chapter that we read is when we read about the death of Sarah. And so we aren't told Isaac's exact age when this happened. And when we see pictures and artwork of this sacrifice of Isaac, we always see him as like a 10-year-old or 12-year-old boy. Caden that we baptized today, he's 10, right? And so we get a picture of a kid about that size. But scholars tend to believe that Isaac was, anywhere from 25 to 37 years old. So you imagine this 100-plus-year-old dad is not exactly tying his kid up and setting him down onto the altar. There had to be some agreement from Isaac for this to have happened. So there's a lot to unpack there for another study. But what we see is that he takes him at either, somewhere around 25 to 30 years old. We don't really know. But if that age of 37 is how old Isaac was when he was nearly sacrificed by Abraham, some scholars believe that if that's the date in his life when that occurred, some believe that the reason for Sarah's death was the near sacrifice of Isaac. And that may very well have been the case. We don't know that. We're not told in the scriptures what caused Sarah's death, but we do know that she died in the very next chapter. Again, it's very linear for us when we read the Bible, and so we don't know exactly how long there was a space between Isaac and Abraham on Mount Moriah, and then here you have Sarah's death. But what we are told in Genesis 23 is that Sarah died in Hebron, that she died in Kiriath Arba at the age of 127. So think about this. She comes onto the stage of the biblical narrative at the age of 65 and lives for almost another 62 years. So for the first half of her life, we don't know anything about her, about what went on or anything like that. But we do know when she died at 127 that Abraham goes and he purchases this cave. It's called the Cave of Machpelah from a man named Ephron the Hittite. And so he bought it to use it as a family burial plot. So he had every intention of not only Sarah being buried there, but him being buried there and maybe even some generations to come. And so the interesting thing is, we're not in our Genesis study, but this is the first time in the Bible that there is a burial mentioned. Sarah's burial, the burial of a woman who is not necessarily given as much page time as her husband, as we've talked about last time, but she is the first person to be mentioned as being buried in the Bible. And in the interesting thing is, in the days of Jesus, King Herod actually built a shrine over the cave where Sarah was buried, because there are actually 6 people buried in that same cave. The first 2 are Abraham and Sarah, then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Leah. Even though Leah was not his favorite wife, Rachel died near Bethlehem and was buried in Bethlehem. And so Leah is buried with with Jacob in Hebron, in that area. It's kind of interesting because when you look at the city of Hebron, where that cave is at, it's about 17 miles south of Jerusalem. You can go and visit this place called the Cave of the Patriarchs today. There is a massive facility there. And it's known as the Cave of the Patriarchs, and it's the place that is traditionally seen as the burial place of Sarah and these other members. And you can go, actually, if you're ever in Israel, you can visit that place today. So that's what we know about Sarah's life and death in a nutshell, of what all went on during her life. But we also want to look at what lessons we can learn from her and how they can impact our lives today. And there are plenty of lessons that we can learn from each of the biblical characters that we look at. There are plenty of lessons we can learn, but the primary lesson we should take away from examining Sarah's life is to trust in God's plan and wait on His timing. That's the big lesson that we learn from looking at Sarah's life. Because when God called Abraham to leave Haran and travel to Canaan, he and Sarah would have been married maybe somewhere around 40 or 50 years at that point. Still didn't have kids, still trying to have kids. And they tried unsuccessfully for all of that time to have children. So when God calls Abraham and promises to make him this great nation, Sarah had to have this renewed hope all of a sudden. Here she is at 65, not had children yet, but now God is saying there's one coming. And despite her age, she had to have had this renewed hope of having a child. And Sarah would have struggled with the same challenges that all of us do as we get older, realizing that we've got more days behind us than we do ahead of us. And so she would have been struggling with this in her life at that point, realizing that she's on the downhill slide of life. And, for her to have a child, she needs to have one sooner rather than later. But like we talked about, it'd be 25 years until she had that child. And so Sarah felt a real burden for getting pregnant because she wanted to do so before she got much older. And for 10 years, as I said earlier, she struggled through that infertility and decided to take matters into her own hands. And she used Hagar and tried to use her to produce an heir for Abraham and herself. And then it would be another 15 years, as we talked about, before God would bring completion of this promise that he started for her when she was in Hebron, all those years before. And Sarah had Isaac at the age of 90. And think about this. They had been married somewhere probably around 70 to 75 years at that point. And we see that this was more than 25 years after God promised them that they would have this child. So had Sarah trusted God's plan, and had she trusted his timing and just sat back and didn't get antsy after 10 years of, well, God's not done this yet, I'm going to help him out. Don't you love it when we do that? Well, God's not doing things fast enough for me, so I'll help him out and I'll do whatever. Had she done differently and waited on God's plan and timing, then we don't know how things would have been different. She may have had Isaac at a younger age. We just don't know when she would have had him. Excuse me. But what we see in the stories surrounding Hagar and the attempt to have an heir for Abraham without following God's plan, what we see is that Sarah was in a tremendous amount of pain in a lot of ways, and much of it her own doing, because the situation that she found herself in caused difficulty not only for her in a lot of ways, but it also caused difficulty between her and Abraham. Because, one of the first things that she does after Hagar finds out she's pregnant and then starts to treat Sarah poorly, Sarah immediately blames Abraham and starts, fussing at him, as we see recorded in the scriptures. So what we learn is that trusting God's plan and trusting his timing is always better than pursuing our own plan and our own timing. Because the challenge for us, though, is that God does not always work his plans according to our plans. He doesn't work his plans according to our wishes or our desires or even our idea of timing. And so sometimes his plans take us in unexpected ways and take us to unexpected places. And we have to trust him during those times when we're in Haran and Canaan and Egypt before we get to where we want to be and where we need to be. Excuse me. Sometimes his timing is also much longer than we anticipated, because God doesn't work on the same clock we do. His timing is vastly different than ours, because he is sitting outside of our concept of time. We are ruled by the clock and the calendar, and we see all of those things. God is not ruled by those things. And so his view of what we understand to be time is vastly different. And so his timing is much different when it comes to our situations. And so his timing is sometimes much longer than we could ever hope for or ever anticipate. So what we need to understand, though, is that when we trust his plan and when we trust his timing, we can avoid our own Hagar moments that can cause us so much pain and so much grief. Because that's what we see in, sorry about that. If I blinded you, I'm sorry. That's what we see in Sarah's life, is that, had she followed God's timing and his plan, then she would have been able to avoid all of the issues between her and Abraham, all of the issues between her and Hagar, if she had just waited and followed God's timing and plan. A lot of that hurt and a lot of that pain that she had to deal with, she could have avoided. So the lesson we learn from Sarah is to wait on God's timing and wait on his plan, even when it is so heart-wrenchingly hard for us to do. And so that is our study of the life of Sarah. And next Sunday, we will be in a new character. We will be looking at Deborah. And so that's the judge that we will be looking at next week when we come back together on Sunday night. And so Wednesday night is our missions night. Our Baptist Men Brotherhood will be in here, and our WMU will be meeting in the choir room. And so next Sunday morning, we'll be into Romans 5:8 in our study of the Romans Road, and then we'll pick up with Deborah on Sunday evening. And so looking forward to a great week of studies and missions and things going on this week. And so as we get